Welcome all, and thank you all for joining. My name is Han, and I am the UNEP WMC China officer. We're very happy to welcome you to the first webinar of the Trade Hub's Trade and Nature Trade-offs and Solutions series today. The purpose of this series is to identify and share case studies, present recent findings, and demonstrate the impact of our work. Webinars will be held monthly, each with a different topical focus. The GCRF TRADE Hub, launched in 2019, is the very first research hub of its kind. This brings together over 50 organizations from 15 different countries to help make trade sustainable for people and the planet. It is funded by the UK Research and Innovations Global Challenges Research Fund, UKRI GCRF. Our researchers are exploring frontiers of transformative change within the trade environment development nexus. And there are novel insights and empirical evidence being developed within the hub that merit sharing with a broader audience as we reach the project's midpoint now. So today's webinar marks the launch of a scoping paper published later today. This was done jointly by the Trade Hub, UNEP, and the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. And the paper is titled Biodiversity and International Trade, a Policy Primer. The report is aimed at policymakers and the stakeholders keen to better understand the relationship between biodiversity, trade, and the trade policy. Most importantly, the paper highlights policy options to better align trade with the goals of international community to halt biodiversity loss. In today's world, trade presents a fundamental feature of our economy, and as an engine of economic growth, has raised the living standards for many. However, trade is also associated with problems by contributing to transport-related emissions and unsustainable consumption, for instance. So in this context, how can we maximize the positive impacts of trade while minimizing negative ones? And how can trade policies help us shift to a more sustainable trade system for all? So today's webinar provides a great opportunity for us to explore these questions from various angles. We will have Mr. James Voss, who will share with us insights from the Dasgupta review on ways that trade is linked to the state of biodiversity, followed by Dr. Caroline Dier-Bergbeck, author of the report to be launched today, who will introduce us to global trade policy dynamics and how these can be leveraged to ensure that global commodity supply chains do not contribute to biodiversity loss. And then we will have Mr. Matheus Couto, who will provide us with an insight on the situation in Brazil and how country-level activities of the Trade Hub support policymaking and sustainable trade. Finally, we have the honor to welcome Dr. Joe Mei from China, who will offer final remarks from the perspective of China. So if we have time, we will then open the floor to audience for questions and comments. I would like to cover some housekeeping rules before we begin. So first, we would like to notify you that today's session will be recorded and the video will be made available on the Trade Hub YouTube channel. And second, your microphone will be muted and your camera will be off during the webinar. And the third, if you would like to comment or ask a question, please type in the chat function throughout the session. If your question is to a particular speaker, I would appreciate if you could please include the names. I will then get back to these questions in the Q&A session. So and the fourth point, it's very important. If you have any technical issues, please send direct message to technical support Laura Mack via the chat. So now I would like to introduce our first speaker, James Voss, who is a lead economist at UNAP WMC. So James has been involved in environmental economic policy making in the UK and internationally for 20 years. And he's a co-lead of the Trade Hub's work on policy solutions and recently co-authored the Trade and the Biosphere chapter for the Dasgupta Review of the Economics of Biodiversity. So welcome, James, over to you.
Thanks. Have I turned mute off? I have, haven't I? Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yes.
Excellent, good. Right, so I guess I'm just setting the scene a little bit really, but doing that through the medium of talking about some work that we did for the Dasgupta Review of the Economics of Biodiversity under the Trade Hub. On the bottom of this slide, I've put the links to the 2 reports that you can get to if you want to. So first slide, what is the Dasgupta Review? It was a big review commissioned by the UK Ministry of Finance. And it was commissioned in 2019 and took about a year and a half to complete. It looked at the relationship between the economy and nature and highlighted really that we've gone way off track. So we've overused nature and degraded our stock of nature to the point that it's very easy to show that it's economically irrational. The returns on investing in nature are much higher than the returns on investing in other types of capital. The review highlights that this is a result of widespread institutional failures, and it suggests that the solution is to almost rebuild economics so it recognizes that the economy is based within nature, which isn't a particularly surprising conclusion, but it is a fairly fundamental one. And it says that we need to really change how we think about our progress, how we measure our progress, and we need to change how we act. It's got some great work in there about that understanding of the underinvestment. It's got some fantastic analysis of the distributional impacts of ecosystem degradation, and it highlights that the need to act is now, not 10 years in the future, because the costs double of action. And it also highlights that we're all asset managers in effect, because the decisions that we all make in our day-to-day life affect the state of nature. So it's very big, it's very comprehensive, it's 600 pages in all, but it does include, as Hans said in the introduction, a chapter on trade, which is based on a paper that we contributed. So I'll take you through that. So the lens that I tried to examine trade and biodiversity through is this idea of the impact inequality, which is presented in the Dasgupta Review. And that's their way of looking at the imbalance between the demands that we place upon nature and the regenerative capacity of nature, so the potential for the planet to supply those needs. So on one side of the equation, it's got the human population and our lifestyles, and then it's got an efficiency indicator as well, so showing how well we change, we use nature to benefit people. It's a very anthropocentric framework, but it does also in the review cover the more ethical values of nature. On the other side of the equation is the regenerative capacity of the biosphere, so that function on the right-hand side. And what I wanted to do through the paper that I wrote was look at how trade might influence the different terms in this impact inequality, and whether trade is likely to be broadening that gap or narrowing that gap. One thing I realized very early on, though, was that one thing that trade does do is make this inequality, or equality if you're reaching sustainability, a global condition, because being able to move goods around means you can have your population that's consuming the benefits we get from nature separately from the regenerative capacity of nature. So you don't have to have balance in this inequality everywhere, because for example, then cities couldn't exist. So being able to move goods around means this is only a global condition. So I had a look through about what might broaden and what might narrow the impact inequality. And in trade analysis, there are a fairly standard set of effects that you look at. So the scale effect, the composition effect, and the technique effect. And I looked at those and tried to look at whether they would be broadening or narrowing the impact inequality. So the scale effect is about trade generating more economic output and more income. And that seemed like something that was likely to be broadening the impact inequality, because on one side it's increasing the demands upon nature, but also if we're not sustainably producing, it's likely to be diminishing the stock of nature that we have as well. I should point out that I was mainly thinking in the context of agricultural commodities when I was doing this work. So then we come to other effects where the impacts were potentially mixed. So the structure or the composition of economies can, I think that's where you get the shifting around of production. So moving to where you might be able to produce goods more effectively. So if you've got better weather conditions and those kind of things, or alternatively, if you've got trade chasing low costs, it might not necessarily, actually, no, I'll talk about that next. So I was going to talk about that in the context of techniques of production, because one of the papers I'll talk about later showed that sometimes you get efficiency gains from improvements in technique. So you get transfers of technologies or ways of making goods in a better way. Sometimes you don't get that. So you get trade chasing low costs, and that might be that you go to a country where wages are particularly low, or it might be that you go to a country where you don't have to pay for impacts on nature. So you might start using nature less efficiently because it's cheaper to do so. I also put on the broadening side of things the increasing risk of species invasions, because that can obviously pull apart the impact inequality. I'm realizing I should now start speeding up because we're running through our time quite quickly. But having looked at that kind of conceptually, I then tried to think about what had been happening in practice. And these are just a couple of nice pictures. There are lots of different papers which have similar conclusions to this. But it does look like trade has been moving impacts on biodiversity around the world. So particularly shifting impacts to the tropics from the consuming regions being Western Europe, North America. So that's a very strong pattern coming through. That's the left-hand side diagram here. And on the right-hand side is also showing that there's a shift from developed to developing countries. So high-income countries seeing that they are benefiting in terms of reduced biodiversity loss, but transferring that biodiversity loss abroad. Another interesting finding was around this technique effect. So is trade making us more efficient at using nature? And the top picture here is from the International Resource Panel report in 2019 that the reference is on the previous slide. But I was intrigued to see that in this one, the bits that I've circled relate to technical progress. And it seems that over the 16 years between 2000 and 2016, technical progress at a global level was actually reducing resource efficiency, which is strange. And then I've got another link at the bottom here to a report which looked at the same thing, but with a very specific trade angle, and found that trade was in fact reducing resource use it was increasing our resource use intensity. So we were getting much less efficient. And that applied to biomass as well. And as I said earlier, their reason for that was that trade was chasing other factors such as low wages rather than driving efficiency, which I thought was an interesting conclusion. I did a review of the various studies that have looked into how much of the biodiversity impact around the world is associated with trade. And I just put up a few of the statistics there, which give you a picture of that, the kind of scale of estimates that are out there, suggesting that 20 to 30% of biodiversity impacts or threats are down to international trade, highlighting that tropical commodities are particularly have a particularly adverse effect on global biodiversity. And then this last point is around the volatility of international trade and why that magnifies the impact to an extent, because or in terms of land use change. Because if you're meeting domestic demand and it's reasonably consistent, then around the margins, the impact of big swings in prices from international markets means that you get relatively big changes as a result at the national level in terms of, as it says there, driving land use change. And the ramifications of that are quite important to think through as well. So it's not just a biodiversity impact. Effectively, because countries aren't compensated for their biodiversity losses, there's a transfer of wealth associated with that, because if you recognize that nature is part of your wealth as a country, and that's being diminished because of trade, there's an effective movement of wealth from exporting countries to importing countries. There's also a potential risk of driving inequality at a local level. So where ecosystem functionality is disturbed, you'll get a benefit to the person or the persons engaged in the commodity trade, but potentially negative impacts elsewhere in the community. And then there's also this point about increasing risks of ecosystem collapse, where the impacts are usually modeled to be disproportionately falling in developing countries, because the richer importing countries tend to be able to trade their way out of trouble. So moving to the next best source. That said, I didn't want this to be an entirely negative story about trade, because as I flagged at the start, trade can pull the impact inequality in both directions. But one thing which did also come through in my review of the literature for this project was that trade is really important for avoiding biodiversity loss. And the graph here is from the bending the curve work. And there, trade is used, especially trade in agricultural products, is used to avoid putting pressure on particularly high value biodiversity areas. And you need trade to allow food to be produced elsewhere, and you need free trade to allow that food to move around effectively. And also it was very exciting to hear Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, who wrote the overall review, talking. He received an international medal, I think it was last week, from Kew Gardens, and he was talking about trade as a particularly hopeful area because he saw a big convergence of interest on sustainable supply chains. So I was going to leave it there because I think Carolyn is going to talk next and talk about some of those potential solutions to help make trade more of a tool for biodiversity and the economy. Sorry, I was a bit long.
That's all right, James. Thanks so much for walking us through the relationship between trade and the biodiversity in practice, both on the negative and the positive, and leave us with a note of hopefulness. Thanks. Now I'd like to welcome our second speaker today, Dr. Caroline Deer-Beck. So Caroline is the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, a partnership between the Graduate Institute and the UN Environment Programme. She's also a senior researcher at the Institute's Global Governance Center, an associate fellow of Chatham House, and the senior research associate at the University of Oxford's Global Economic Governance Programme. So Caroline today is going to share with us her work, particularly around this to be launched paper on biodiversity and international trade policy, a scoping of issues, opportunities, and challenges. Over to you, Caroline.
Great, thank you so much, Han. Can you hear me okay and see the screen?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, and thank you, James, as always, for such an amazing overview of the links and the various issues at hand at the intersection of biodiversity and trade. So my job in the panel discussion today is really to help us think through where trade can act as an ally for biodiversity and nature, and also where are some of the most promising levers to help trade policy levers and levers alongside trade policy that could help us to transition to more sustainable supply chains for commodities and wildlife. And so I would say on both fronts, my general advice today is that there's no simple answer to any of this. There are no silver bullets. There's not one way, for instance, that we are going to fix trade agreements so that they are better for biodiversity or for nature. And there's no simple answer to how we would align trade policy in general, more with biodiversity conservation, sustainable use and restoration. But there are many avenues that we can pursue. And so in my presentation today, I do plan to provide an overview of some of the issues, opportunities and challenge related to biodiversity and international trade policy. And to conclude with some ideas of where I see some of the greatest prospects for progress lying. What I'll say today is an abbreviated version of analysis provided in the paper that was mentioned before that should be published online later today. And the purpose of the paper is really to provide an overview. It doesn't have the answer or claim to have, even really a set of recommendations on what's the way forward. It's rather trying to scope the issues, opportunities, and challenges to provide a way for policymakers both on the environment side and the trade side, and for researchers both on the trade side and the environment side to understand and navigate this issue a little better. So I'm going to just touch briefly today on some of the key issues noted in the paper. So the first is the paper starts out by trying to review the range of biodiversity related topics on the trade, environment, and sustainable development agenda. Now, of course, in James's presentation and the Trade Hub project, we're focusing very much on sustainable trade in commodities and wildlife. But I think it's really important, especially in the trade context, to understand the wider array of issues that are on the table and how these issues emerge in the very particular world that is trade policy and trade negotiations. So just on this slide, the first thing I wanted to emphasize is that in the wider policy arena, there's an increasing focus on trying to grapple with nature issues alongside climate issues, or at the same time that they're intersecting challenges, and also to see challenges of pollution as intersecting with those as well. So that there's sort of these triple crises, and we can't really just treat biodiversity as a standalone issue. Certainly it's hard for trade policymakers to do so, and I think also for environmental policymakers to do so. So here around the circle, I won't go through all of them in any detail, but these are some of the sort of buzzwords that appear in the trade policy. The most obvious way in which biodiversity issues appear on the trade agenda is around fish subsidies negotiations, which are essentially about saving fish stocks. And in that context, marine biodiversity. But we have many other different ways in which it appears. So one, you find efforts, for example, to promote trade in environmental goods and services, including some goods and services that are biodiversity based. So many developing countries are very interested in biotrade, with the understanding that promoting economic opportunities in the conservation and sustainable use of nature, in the sustainable use of certain biodiversity-based products can support wider conservation efforts and therefore support biodiversity. You also have long-standing negotiations on topics of sustainability standards and labels. And here on the one hand, you have this effort to raise environmental standards. And you also have a lot of concerns from developing countries about ensuring that these standards are designed in ways that reflect the challenges that their producers face, particularly small and medium-sized producers and low-income communities, and also to help them to be able to meet those standards and pay for certification and so on, so that they're not disadvantaged in international markets around these products, for these products, and also that they can actually use that potential market access as a way of driving an incentive to raise the sustainability of production processes and methods. We have lots of discussions underway around the range of voluntary efforts that companies are taking to boost sustainability in supply chains through, for example, sustainability standards, but also other mechanisms that they're using to try and incentivize more sustainable production and to favor sustainably produced products. Looking around the other side of the circle, another issue that's really live in trade negotiations is around green aid for trade and trade finance. And here the issue is really that in order to produce more sustainably, many countries and businesses need more access to resources, to technological, to finance, to capacity building around environmental legislation and its implementation, enforcement, and also just around converting production towards greater sustainability. An interesting area at the moment is that there's also discussion of how to promote more sustainable agriculture. And a lot of this traditionally has been around issues of food security and how to ensure that farmers in developing countries reap greater returns from their participation in global trade. But increasingly, this interest in biodiversity is pushing a sort of more environmentally sustainable agricultural discussion onto the table. And of course, other issues on the table are things like trade in wild species and the role of trade in enabling the movement of invasive alien species that can also be damaging to biodiversity. So this is like just a super swift tour de table of what's out there, but these are the kinds of issues that are on the trade agenda in various ways, at various levels of development. But it's important, I think, for those working on biodiversity to have this sense of the wider context there. I'm just going to move to the next slide. So what I wanted to do with this slide is just to underline that there's, I won't go into all of the details on it, but when we think about shifting trade, we can think about shifting the trade rules, that are in agreements, and there are things that can be done in that respect, but we can also think about what happens behind the border in countries. Because there's a range of challenges, as I think I've alluded to already, around the cost of meeting environmental standards, around shifting to those, of making sure you have adequate finance for transformation, and also doing things like addressing market access distortions that may actually be driving your producers to produce less sustainably, because that's the way to be competitive. Perversely, it's the way to be competitive on global markets, and that's especially the case, many developing countries argue, because developed countries have such high subsidies, especially for agriculture, so that in order to compete, they compete on environmental grounds instead. So there's a whole set of issues around the challenges that are there, that are not all of those are about trade rules per se. And then on the right-hand side here, the other issue that it's important to consider is this importance of complementary actions and cooperation that might be taken, so that when we think about trade policy, I think it's important that we don't just think about sort of punishing competitors and penalizing them into changing their actions and restricting market access. We have to think about how we're actually going to promote greener production in those countries, whether or not it's imported to our countries or not, but for their own benefit at the national level and for whoever else they're exporting to. One of the big challenges in the world of trade is not to make sure that you're not just closing your own borders to products that you don't that don't meet your sustainability standards, but those products might just be shipped somewhere else in the world. So you're not actually achieving the goal of shifting the production on the ground. And then the fourth area is beyond government. There's many things that can be done to support more sustainable supply chains. So I'm going to just move to the next slide. Sorry, and I know I'm probably running out of time already. So what we did in the paper is just sample some of the areas that might be ripe for policy action, dialogue and research. And here's sort of 5 buckets of areas that we outlined, but I just want to focus quickly on 2. I think in the world of trade negotiations, one of the areas where there's the greatest potential to engage on biodiversity issues is around agricultural negotiations, and to see whether it's possible to introduce a greater emphasis on environmental sustainability through those negotiations. And here I think it may be important for us to step beyond a very narrow focus on things like deforestation-free supply chains, no matter how appealing they are to constituencies in developed countries. It's also important to look at the wider array of trade-related factors that may be affecting the incentives in developing countries for them to be producing and exporting certain kinds of goods. And I think here we need to listen carefully to the other trade-related issues that they put on the table. Some of those are around market access for higher value added goods. Some of them are around things like environmentally harmful subsidies that developed countries have in place that they argue distort their trading prospects. So I think that's one important area. I think a second important area, looking in this second bluer box that I have, is around the importance of working out how we can implement high environmental standards everywhere and what it will take to do that. What kind of cooperation is necessary among this vast multitude of voluntary standards that are out there to make it simpler for producers everywhere to comply, to make sure that they have the financial support to comply, and also to see whether we can't make more of those voluntary standards mandatory, but in a way that works across multiple jurisdictions, so that it's not so complicated for green businesses to compete internationally, and that countries that do have high environmental standards have an incentive to raise them, but also to bring other countries with them. So that should kind of be our goal, I think, in the environmental standards area. And I think that will be particularly important around biodiversity issues. The other area that I feel is really important and understudied is around how we're going to really help countries themselves to assess the impacts of trade agreements on biodiversity, and to work out exactly where they need more trade-related financial cooperation or technological cooperation to make sure they have access to the right, to the resources that they need in order to make production more sustainable. And then the final area that I would just mention here is around trade in biodiversity-based products. But I think in the trade arena, we do need to find ways to work out where countries are sustainably producing products. How can we make sure that they have opportunities to trade those internationally and to generate revenues that their producers need nationally? So then the very last slide, I'll just turn to that quickly, is just to note that there are a whole range of different fora where we can take up these issues. I won't go through all of them now, but the key is to say that you have, there are trade-related processes like the WTO and FTAs and so on, but there are other processes that we can also look to around where there's for environmental cooperation or agricultural cooperation, where we can look to see if we can raise standards through those, so that you have a sort of conversation going on between the areas where we're trying to raise environmental standards and the trade arena. We don't need to set environmental standards through the trade arena, but we need to make sure that somewhere in the international system we're setting them, or countries are cooperating nationally to look for ways to coordinate around high environmental standards. And then the trading system its role is really to enable that greener trade to take place. The final thing I wanted to mention here on the last slide is that we do have some important opportunities, I think, at the multilateral level to take forward discussion of these issues. And one of them is the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability at the WTO. And this is a new process that was started last year, and it aims to provide a new forum at the WTO for governments to work together to identify priorities, to determine options and look for ways forward on environment and trade issues. It was launched last year with 53 members, and it's open to all WTO members to participate in. They've also made some provision for stakeholder participation thus far. But for the WTO Ministerial Conference in December, there's an effort to have a ministerial statement on environmental sustainability, with the idea that this should engage a far larger number than the original 53 members of countries committing to the need for more enhanced dialogue on trade and environment issues going forward. And ideally, we could put issues like biodiversity and sustainable agriculture on that agenda so that it's something that we can really start to grapple with some of the ways forward on this issue. Not that all of the answers will be at the WTO, but it's a place for trade policymakers from around the world to come together and work out where and how they can make progress in ways that will promote more sustainable commodities, trade and agricultural trade. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Caroline, for sharing with us the really excellent presentation and to get all of us thinking about how we can make the sustainability issue into the trade agenda at international and also cross borders at national levels. So next, I'd like to invite our third speaker, Mr. Matheus Couto. So Matheus is the program officer at UNEP-WMC Brazil, and Matheus currently works with UNEP-WMC as a program officer in Brazil since 2017, supporting UNEP-WMC and UNEP Brazil country office on biodiversity, sustainable development and ecosystem restoration issues. So today Matheus is going to share with us the country level activities from Brazil Hub under the Trade Hub, and bring in both the social and environmental aspects that Trade Hub is focusing on in Brazil. Over to you, Matheus.
Thank you, Han, for the intro. Let me share my slides. Can you please let me know if you are seeing the slides?
Yes, all good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Han, for the introduction, and it's great to be talking after Caroline and James, the great overview of the issues on how we can make the trade system more sustainable. And my objective is to have a deep dive in the Brazilian context to understand how trade affects the territory, because the territory is where you see actually the changes and the social, the sustainable development indicators happening. So Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse by any way you look at it, and it is also an environmental powerhouse. Brazil has been competing with the US on as the largest soybean producer in the country, in the world, and also the largest exporter. On the lower right side, you see how the soybean productivity yields increased since the 1980s. And this happened due to a lot of investments, especially from the Brazilian Agricultural Research Institute, Embrapa, on making soybean productive in non-traditional territories like the Amazon and Sejado. But this increase of production has also an environmental and social cost, because Brazil has a huge biodiversity, is considered a mega diverse country, and has one of the largest, actually the largest network of protected areas in the world. And so it is key to deal with how we can increase production and reduce deforestation and reduce the impacts on the ecosystems in Brazil. So in the context of the Trade Hub project, we are focusing in the Sejado, which is an ecosystem located in the central Brazil. It is the most diverse tropical savanna. It has flat terrains, and it has 12 major water basins in Brazil, so there is a lot of water, and it makes it perfect for agricultural production. But 50% of the Sejado has already been converted into pasture and agriculture. The opportunity for agricultural production has also an impact on the land prices. So we see that once the agricultural commodity infrastructure starts increasing in the territory, it generates an impact on the land prices, and it also creates an impact on concentration of land. Sejado is half of the size of the Amazon, and the ecosystem conversion, so deforestation in this biome, releases 250 million tons of carbon CO2 equivalent annually. So in the Brazil Hub, we are having a look on how can trade policies strengthen sustainability and sustainable development in the production territory. We have 7 lines of research. The first research is done by University of São Paulo. We are developing system mapping on how the beef supply chain is impacted by globalization. So, and what are the lever points for increasing sustainability in the beef supply chain? What we are realizing in the Brazil Hub is that beef is likely the commodity that will most increase due to the trade agreements in Brazil, and we want to understand how we can increase sustainability in this supply chain. We're also, in collaboration with University of São Paulo and Fora, producing a study on how soybean intensification can be an instrument to reduce deforestation and land sparing, and producing novel information on looking at deforestation within the farm boundaries, not as in a point of view of expansion in the territory. We have a third line of research, which is looking at the social impacts of agricultural commodities in Brazil, which I have a next slide to provide more information. And this is produced in partnership with SEBRAP, a research organization based in São Paulo. The International Institute of Sustainability is producing 3 research outputs. They've just produced initial results for the modeling on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. They will be producing a policy brief on the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, and the biodiversity outcomes of agricultural commodities production on international trade scenarios. And a 4th research line from the International Institute of Sustainability will analyze the costs and benefits of agricultural trade in Brazil. So having a deeper look in the social impacts in Brazil, on the right side you see an image, a map of the Mato Piba region, which is the most dynamic agricultural frontier in Brazil. And there, the territory has been classified in 4 categories. On blue, you have high production municipalities and high social indicators, which is mostly GDP. In yellow, high production, low social indicators. Pink, low production, high social indicators. And red, low production and low social indicators. So we understand that trade can have positive, neutral, or negative impacts, and we want to understand how to increase the positive social impacts in the territory. In November, we will launch 3 reports. The first is focused on gender in soybean production. The second is on food security and commodity production in the territory, because what we are finding is that once municipalities are increasing soybean production, they decrease food production that is consumed locally. So this has been highlighted by James and Caroline previously, but it's interesting to have national data to support this. And the third report is on conflict and violence, and this happens mostly because of land conflicts, since Brazil still has some territories that are undesignated. So it's public land that has not been designated for concessions, protected areas, or rural settlements. And there are many communities in the territory that are responsible for conserving the Sejado, although they don't have clear land tenure rights. So also in the context of the trade agreements, it's key to understand the Brazilian NDC, so the Brazilian climate target. In 2015, Brazil presented the NDC, and the target is to reduce 37% by 2025 and 43% in 2030. The baseline was producing, having the year of 2005 emissions of 2.1 billion tons. And in 2015, it had an annex presenting the goal of zero illegal deforestation in the Amazon region by 2030, and the target of ecosystem restoration of 12 million hectares. And last year in 2020, the third national inventory reviewed the baseline and increased the, it was correct to review the baseline with improved calculations, but it increased the amount of emissions in 2005, and the targets remain the same. So this represents an additional emission of 0.4 gigatons of CO2. And also in this new NDC, there is no annex. So the goal of restoring 12 million hectares, which is often referred in the trade agreements, and the zero illegal deforestation in the Amazon, it's not present in the national designated contribution. So my final message is that it's key for making trade sustainable. It's key to preserve Brazilian forests. Thus, it mobilized as an effective and cheap solution to address climate change and biodiversity loss. And making trade sustainable is possible, but we need to understand the national context and mobilize trade policies to provide safeguarding incentives in support of national frameworks. Our research is showing that Brazil is able to meet the climate demand of soybean and other protein without deforestation. And this is why we need a safeguard to ensure it. And it's also showing that this can be one of the cheapest climate solutions, as the cost of reducing deforestation is less than $3 in the research that we are doing. The Brazilian agriculture depends on the ecosystem services because most of it's rain-fed agriculture. So it's in the interest of Brazilian farmers to preserve the forest. And these are my final messages. Thank you, Han, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Matthias, for reminding us the importance of understanding national context and the importance of data. And also I like the presentation you provided in terms of using the analytical approach to really understand how we can enhance positive impacts and reduce negative impacts of trade. So today's final panelist, we have the honor to have Dr. Joe Mei, who is the Deputy Director at the Institute of American and Oceania Study in the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation under the Ministry of Commerce. So during his 15 years at Caltech, Dr. Joe's research has covered the outward investment, international contracting, international labor cooperation, and international aid, trade in services, multilateral and bilateral agreements in support of China. So over to you, Dr. Joe, to provide us with today's final remarks.
Thank you, Han. I think it's a very nice time in China. We are having the Mid-Autumn Festival in these days. So I also want to congratulate every panelist for the great speeches. And I learned a lot from your speeches. from James' speeches, we learned that there will be some possibilities when we're comparing with the demand and the supply of the trade and related policies. And Caroline provide us a lot of different kind of a combination about the policy.
Yes, maybe you can turn off your video just to save the bandwidth.
Okay, so I think that, how's that? Is that good?
Yeah, it's better. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I just mentioned that I have learned a lot from the panelists who giving us not only the examples, but also the policy suggestions on the possible relationship between the trade and the sustainability and biodiversity. And our team was is new to this kind of research of collaboration between all the stakeholders around the globe. So I think that we are just trying to review the process, especially in the past decades, to see whether there are some kind of relationship between the trade volumes, the trade structures, trade destination, the partnership with the trade policies. So I think that during these kind of topics, I believe that we should think about the different impacts of trade, as the panelists also mentioned, that they should have two sides, in fact, bad things or good things. And I think that there may be some kind of reason why we are reaching this stage, is because that we are trying to develop the trade itself. We haven't make the policies and the ideas of biodiversity to go at the same time. So I think that maybe in the future we should try to improve the ideas of the people, not only from the government, but also from different stakeholders in the countries. China is the biggest import and export country in the world. I think that we definitely will be involved in this kind of matters. And I believe that every country has a different kind of emphasis in the different stages of the development. It means that when we are trying to do something, we should try to improve the coordination between us. And if we think about this issue in another way, especially in the year of 2020, when we are seeing that the trade decreased because of the COVID-19, I think whether we observe some good effects to do with the biodiversity, or if we just separate all the regions or the countries, maybe we will see the even harmer in the future. So I think there are a lot of very
that we've had a connection issue, as always for virtual conferences, but we have received very interesting questions, and my colleagues have managed to synthesize these. So I'd like to keep the floor open for maybe the first question thrown to our panelists, if anyone wants to provide remarks. So the first question actually combined is there have been several really interesting questions focusing on the question of demand. So how can we balance trade's role in making available cheap products to all the one hand and environmental impacts of production disposal on the other? I'd like to open this to our panelists, if anyone wants to chip in to respond to this question.
Yeah, I guess I can. I don't really have a solution, but I think it's really strongly identified as an enormous problem. So it's a big feature of the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity. They highlight the lifestyle part of that as something that really needs to change. The one thing they do say in there, which is quite interesting, is about how our preferences work and how that change might not necessarily feel quite as bad, because humans like to keep up with their neighbours and do similar things to the people around them. So if our preferences are like that, if we see everyone else reducing their consumption, where it's, you know, spurious consumption, not necessarily related to needs, then we might want to do that as well. So it won't feel necessarily as bad, which is quite an interesting way of thinking about it. I'm not sure that trade has a particularly strong role in terms of reducing demand to sustainable levels, but having said that, it does in specific places. So CITES, for example, works by regulating trade in species where they're under a particular threat, and does limit the numbers of creatures or products that can be taken. So there might be a specific role, but I don't think the trade system is set up to constrain us within sustainable limits. What do you think, Carolyn?
Well, I thank you, James. I mean, I think it's really tricky. I think the main thing, trade is a vehicle for it's a conveyor belt for unsustainable consumption and production. So in that sense, it has a role to play in reining in unsustainable consumption and production. But if I can just leap, there are a couple of questions that are sort of pushing me to sort of what are 2 or 3 big things that would make a difference. And I think here, the key thing when we talk about trade and environment is it always needs to start at home, with stronger environmental policies at home and enforcement at home. More engagement of environmental constituencies and green businesses at home in helping set their national trade policy agenda. So that means when the government is confronted with external pressures to green trade or green production, there's actually a constituency for that at the national level who can provide informed opinion about how to do this in ways that will also support local communities and local businesses. I mean, I'm sure Matthias can speak more to that, but I just want to, the key thing is for northern environmental groups, you know, if it's northern groups who are concerned about this, to recognize there's constituencies at the national level who care about this stuff, to listen to them and to ask them what's the best way of helping you to transform production nationally and to get the support you need nationally to win over your national government on these kinds of issues. So that's a first area. A second one is just around standards. I mean, there's such a proliferation of well-meaning standards all over the world, and business struggle to get a grip on these. Now, the International Trade Center and IISD are doing great work to provide a map of many of these standards in ways that would help business to know what's out there, what do we have to comply with, but it's still an extremely messy terrain. So I think anything that we can do to help governments nationally get a handle on voluntary standards at the national level, and help to come up with something a bit more coherent, and then work with each other, because if it's trade that's going across borders, we need sustainability standards that on the one hand are adapted to local conditions and are flexible to apply to local conditions, but on the other hand mean that goods everywhere are having to raise the bar. And that means that consumers everywhere will not be able to consume terrible goods because everyone's in alignment that we need to move this up. So I think that anything we can do that's around cooperation around standards is really, really important. And then the third thing is, sure, we need to be willing to promote trade in the good stuff, make sure that the good stuff, there is opportunities for the good stuff, and also be willing to restrict where it's not, but to do that on the basis of international standards that make sense around the world, and also that's accompanied by really concerted efforts of capacity building, a technology transfer, at financing, so to support companies to actually make this transition. Otherwise, we're just punishing people who are struggling the most. We risk doing that. And I think on the one other thing I would say is not to underestimate the fact that sometimes these are very large multinationals also involved in this, and they can play a role as supply chain leaders, but in countries themselves, it's not only good guys, like they're big, powerful national companies that, that need to be grappled with in order to produce more sustainably. And that's something that we need to support local environmental constituencies to help tackle at the national level as well. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's probably more than my minute or two. So I'm sorry, Han.
I think you managed to cover all the 3 questions we summarized, Caroline. Thanks. So we did receive lots of questions around, the standards, voluntary rules, regulations, and also around the businesses. So if all the panelists are okay, I think we have really interesting session today, and we have one more question, if it's okay for you to all stay online for another 5 minutes. My final question. So here is another question from our audience. It's very difficult for businesses that seek to improve their sustainability to access information on sustainability of so many biodiversity derived products which they may wish to use or sell. So how can this information gap or information flow be addressed? I think for this one, Caroline also touched upon, but I'd like to invite also the other panelists who may wish to share your remarks on this question around businesses.
I was going to say Mateus must have something from Brazil here.
Mateus,
Yes,
go ahead.
I can start with that. So this is one of the goals of the project, right? To identify, we have many information, but the information is scattered, and we need to organize and synthesize this information, make it available for our business. And this will be addressed during the course of the Trade Hub project. In Brazil, I think what is important regarding the, we had a first glance in the global biodiversity framework modeling and addressing the previous question also. I think it's possible to have a sustainable level of trade and enforcing the global biodiversity framework for the countries, and putting the GBF in the same level as the climate agreement should be one of the key issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Mateus. Dr. Joe, would you have anything to share with us on this question?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, very clear.
Okay. So as for the information, I think that the Chinese government is trying to address the sustainability and biodiversity issue, and we are trying to provide more information to the potential investors or the people who want to do the international trade. So we published the guidebook for the outward investment and cooperation, and I was involved in this work for continuously, I think almost 10 years. Actually, each year we are trying to update some parts of that, try to address more information, not only from the biodiversity, but from different kinds of things. So we also are trying to publish some kind of guidelines as a ministry levels regulations, maybe not regulation, but just the guidelines for the enterprises to do business and try to follow. And at the same time, the commercial office of China in different countries also trying to address or trying to follow the regulations and the new published rules in different countries to publish them on the website of the Ministry of Commerce. So I believe that this kind of things, efforts are not enough to address the gap, but we are trying to make the enterprises know better about the different kind of requirements at different countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we've got all the panelists sharing the views around these questions. And with that, I'm going to wrap up today's session. Thank you to all of our speakers today again, to Caroline, James, me, and Mateus. Thanks so much. Our next webinar in this series is going to be around science-based decision-making, metrics and tools from the Trade Hub. It will be held on Tuesday, the 19th of October, from 2 to 3 in the afternoon UK time. Please do our own calculations when you're based in other time zones. The registration link will be shared in the chat. Please save that and save the date. The recording of today's webinar will be available on the Trade Hub YouTube channel. If you wish to stay updated about the Trade Hub project, please visit our website or follow us on social media. So thank you all for your attendance today, and I wish everyone a very nice day and happy Mid-Autumn Festival to colleagues from China. Thanks.
Thank you.